This is the Week 3 lecture, Part 2. In this lecture, I am going to touch briefly on recovery and resilience, and then transition to mental health. For the sake of expanding our emergency management vocabulary, I have created a couple of slides to differentiate between recovery and resilience. I suppose it's splitting hairs a bit, but hey, this is graduate school, so that's part of what we do. And don't just memorize the terms, try to wrap your head around the concepts and maybe even talk about them with your peers to help try to make them stick. Recovery could be considered a subset of resilience. As noted in the IS 1A course through FEMA, recovery involves the restoration, strengthening, and revitalization of infrastructure, housing, the economy, and other fundamental underpinnings of the community. Resilience is more about capacity and capability to respond and recover to an emergency. It touches on flexibility or adaptability to a crisis. One Department of Homeland Security source defined resilience as, quote, the ability to recover from or adjust to adversity or change, the ability of systems, infrastructures, government, business, and citizenry to absorb and or quickly recover from an adverse event or series of events caused by attack or natural disaster, end quote. So the idea of absorbing and adjusting to crises differs from a strict recovery from the event. In a sense, resilience is somewhat more philosophical and asks questions like, do we have the right people and the right systems in place that gives us the best chance of bouncing back from the next one? Or maybe, do we have innovation, creativity, and flexibility built into our response plans? Recovery, on the other hand, is more concrete and asks questions such as, do we have the generators in the best place? And what can we do to ensure that roads will be opened as soon as possible? Lastly, I want to talk about recovery of a different sort, emotional recovery. And not emotional recovery of the community per se, but of our first responders. First responders are trained extensively for what we call the initial attack. They are told the best way to arrive safely at the emergency, what equipment to bring, what equipment to wear, how to effectively handle each of the tools they're assigned, and how to walk step by step through the process of solving the problem. What they are not routinely trained to do is mitigate the long-term effects of seeing, hearing, smelling, and touching things that most people would never experience even once in their life, let alone the number of times one would experience that in a 20 or more year career of it. The emergency manager may not be a first responder themselves, but the effects that crises take on first responders are a real and present danger to their welfare, and, by extension, to any efforts at mitigating an emergency of any size in the future. In the spirit of maintaining the ongoing mindset of mitigation, the emergency manager must think through what first responders may not consider for themselves. First responders are not what they used to be, and by that I do not mean that they've gotten softer or weaker. I mean that the very group that we consider to be first responders has evolved and are not limited to the traditional disciplines such as just police, fire, and EMS. It now includes non-traditional responders, such as construction workers that have to clear away debris, sometimes with the remains of bodies amidst the rubble. And public health workers that are exposed to grotesque and extreme hazards are in that group as well. For the same reasons, it includes search and rescue personnel and healthcare providers. These groups are exposed to some of the same prolonged and intense exposure to death, injury, and destruction on a wide scale. Emergency managers need to be familiar with signs of mental health stress so they can make appropriate recommendations for individuals and to make staffing decisions regarding who is best to be assigned to do what kind of work. Those exposed to these extreme conditions may manifest the effects in three different ways. There are mild or transient distress, which includes sleep loss, maybe increased fear, anxiety, anger, and sadness. There might be moderate symptoms, such as prolonged insomnia and long-term changes in personal behavior. And most seriously, it could develop into psychological illness, which includes PTSD or prolonged major depression requiring professional treatment. While there are 3 basic levels of severity of the effects for responding to traumatic events, it does not necessarily take place in a linear, incremental way. There are too many variables at play, and frankly, I'm not a mental health professional. However, in the assigned reading this week, there is a graphic that illustrates the interconnectedness of some of these behaviors and symptoms. You can see how these consequences bear themselves out in very different ways, from excessive fear to over-dedication. In fact, Dr. Kevin Gilmartin is a behavioral scientist for law enforcement, and he refers to that last phenomenon as overinvestment in the job. While extraordinary events such as 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina or Superstorm Sandy, the Joplin, Missouri tornadoes, and others serve as a clear impetus for some mental health issues, the kind of quote-unquote everyday crises of emergency responders can contribute to many of the same effects. Clark and Tracy Paris, a couple that offers mental health training to law enforcement, have a presentation that they call Winning the Battle. And the two of them refer to the process of dealing with everyday issues as cop stew. What is routine to first responders would be horrific to most people. The fact that first responders are exposed to them routinely does not eliminate the impact on that responder. First responders have different sized pots, but each time they experience these unique and disturbing events, each time they log another macabre image in their mind, they add a little bit more to their pot. And without healthy ways of reducing the level of that stew, the pot may eventually boil over unexpectedly, resulting in some of the behaviors noted on the previous slide. Predictors of future problems are tied to 3 factors: proximity, duration, and intensity. Or in other words, how close they are to the crisis, how long they are exposed to it, and to what degree they must actually be involved with it. If emergency managers are familiar with these factors and are in a position to advise decision makers as the response unfolds, they may be able to save the lives and families of these responders after the crisis ends. Finding ways to limit these factors for individuals may be one of the most important things an emergency manager does in her career. Looking at the factors that may mitigate the effects, there are ones that can be controlled and some that cannot. One of those factors includes the characteristics of the individual disaster and of the responder. The DNA of the two and how they interact is clearly out of the control of the emergency manager. A second factor is the responder's past training and experience in dealing with significant crises. And now, here, the emergency manager may have some input as far as adding to the training for the responder, but ultimately, probably the emergency manager is going to have very little control over how much experience is going to take place in this area. The final piece, however, is post-event support. And here the emergency manager can fill an important gap. Identifying resources before the emergency hits and facilitating their use afterward is a proven winner. Here, again, is mitigation, finding ways to diminish the negative consequences of disasters with our most important resource, our people.